Should we
Hello,
do a
everybody.
countdown?
Welcome to 221 Baker Street. I'm Les Klinger. I'm fortunate to be the moderator of this panel. Uh, and as you can see on your screen, and I can't even tell you what's right to left now, but we have a wonderful and estimable panel of speakers today, coming to us from all parts of the globe. I'm in California. Below me on the screen is Laurie King, who is now the author of how many novels? 24,
God knows.
25?
I don't know.
Something like that. And there are now 17 in the Mary Russell series. Is that? I've lost count.
Whatever.
Whatever. So Laurie's here in California with me. Elizabeth Crowens, an author of fiction that includes Conan Doyle as a character, among other interesting folks. And Elizabeth is coming to us live from New York today. To my right, Liese Sherwood-Fabre, an author who resides in Texas and who has written a number of novels about Sherlock Holmes, as well as a good deal of nonfiction about Sherlock Holmes. And for the farthest traveled award, although she doesn't look any farther away, we have Bonnie MacBird. Bonnie is in London. And Bonnie is the author. There are now 3 books out in the series of novels for HarperCollins. The 4th one is coming out soon, I think. Yes, in March. The 4th, The Three Locks, comes out in March. And Laurie has a new book. This is the commercial part, folks. Laurie's new book comes out next summer. I don't know about you, Liese or Elizabeth. Most importantly, Laurie and I have a new anthology coming out in December called In League with Sherlock Holmes, which are stories inspired by the Sherlock Holmes canon. It's not too late to pre-order the book. So our topic today is supposed to be, what would Sherlock do? About what is what we all said initially, but we're not going to talk about the election or what Sherlock would do about the virus or things like that. I think what we want to talk about a little bit is the forensic aspects of the Sherlock Holmes stories, a subject about which we know the stories, but about which, as a matter of science, we know virtually nothing, and therefore we're very qualified to speak about it. But we wanted to talk a little bit about, or I wanted to talk about, the stories that include forensic science in them, and discussed a little bit Holmes's sort of pioneering. And then I was hoping that each of the real writers on this panel, which is everybody except me, would talk a little bit about their fiction and their research into police science of the day that they're writing about. So Laurie's years are set in the 1920s, early 1920s. Bonnie's years are the 1880s and 1890s. And Liese and Elizabeth, your Conan Doyle novels, I'm not sure exactly when they take place. And Liese, same with yours. I'm not quite sure what the chronology is.
1867, 68 right now. It's when he's 13, 14 years old. It's the early case file.
Why don't we start with you? Because that's the oldest, I think, in terms of science.
Yeah.
So what do your books reflect? I mean, what was going on in those days?
Well, it was really kind of, this was the very beginning of really applying science to solving crime. And it actually, there was an awful lot going on. The first pathologist came out, and I found this interesting. I came across this, that an anatomist asked, "How are you made?" A pathologist, or somebody who does autopsies, asks, "How did you die?" And I thought that was a really interesting quote. And they actually had the pathology, it was called medical jurisprudence, or legal medicine. And there were things that were published back in 1836, 1845 in England. And you can get that on Google Books.
Starting down the road of science. And of course, it clearly included brandy. Everything included brandy in those days, right? So forensic science, you couldn't be a forensic scientist without a flask of brandy, I assume. So I think, Bonnie, yours are probably next in chronological order, maybe, or you and Elizabeth both. So where did you pick up from there? I mean, what have you worked into your stories? I mean, what interesting science of the day?
Well, I mean,
Or did you just ignore the actual science and make it up?
No, I don't know. I know that's part of the fun is to use the real science, actually. But, if you really look at his deductions, very few of them are actually based in forensics. There's blood splatters, there's fingerprints, and there's footprints. And not a whole lot else would fall into that bin of forensics. But what was so interesting is that at that time, you could, just by observation, providing you had the knowledge also, deduce an immense amount of things about people that you can't do now. Because then, people's clothing, their accent, their hairstyle, their calluses on their hands, all these things spoke volumes to Holmes and allowed him to piece together the story. So that's already the first interesting thing. When I write a murder scene for my minor traditional Holmes, and they're in the emulating the canon. So I'm trying to create stuff that only would be in existence right then. So I work backwards. So just as an example, I had to. He finds a dead body of a young woman in an ice pit in my second novel. That's Unquiet Spirits. It takes place in the Scottish Highlands in the winter. And he finds his dead body. And from a whole bunch of observations about it, it's a decapitated body. But he can tell by the way the angle of the neck that the head was still on when it went in there and froze. And he can tell it was moved because it doesn't match where it was sitting. And he could tell that a young man came in and tried to rescue her, and water was thrown in him because all of the fabric of his clothing was covered with a very thin sheen of ice, as opposed to her, and she was just frozen straight through. So he deduces all this stuff from what he sees. So technically it's forensics, but it isn't necessarily some forensics that's unusual or particular to the time. The Bertillon method, of course, is interesting, but that wasn't really forensics so much as a categorization of identifying features, which was created in an effort to make, to make a database of criminals. But I love that for Holmes, it's really all about observation. So another one of my favorites was, I wanted him to notice that a woman was pregnant before her husband, who was a doctor, knew. So it's like, how can I possibly do that? And so I looked up what were folk remedies for morning sickness right at that time. And oranges was one of them. So he notices, she's acting peculiar in a certain way about something. And he notices oranges on her windowsill. It's dead of winter in the Highlands, and nobody would have that. I mean, it's very, very expensive. So he deduces that she's pregnant before her husband knows. So things like that, but working backwards, I like, how can I create something where he figures it out before the other person? And it's really more a question of observation of minute detail and weird detail.
Elizabeth, do you have some examples?
I do. I like to go to the source because I use Conan Doyle actually as a character in my novels.
Right.
And of course, Conan Doyle came up with a lot of the inspiration that he came up with for Sherlock Holmes was from his teacher, Dr. Joseph Bell, from the University of Edinburgh when he was getting his medical degree. So I love reading some of the biographies because he would come up with those observations that we eventually will see in the Sherlock Holmes character, where somebody would be brought into the clinic and he'd be able to tell by the fingernails, by the tone of the skin, by a tear in the pants, that this person had this particular profession and this is where they lived, and this was probably their diagnosis. So I love getting into that, the Joseph Bell kind of inspiration. And of course, the fact that Conan Doyle was also a doctor. And, many times he was able to, because of his medical knowledge, come up with things that eventually wound up in Sherlock Holmes stories.
Yeah, so I mean, I think, and Laurie, I want to ask you about the 20s, but I want to point out, I mean, some of the things, and I'll grab a book and show it to everybody in a few minutes, but there are some things that Holmes did that were new ideas. One of them was the Locardian principle. I mean, which is Edmund Locard, who later enunciated this, the principle that interactions of people and places leave traces. Well, Holmes was already doing that. I mean, he is the first real crime scene investigator. Now it's got its own television show, that thing. But he knew that he was looking for traces at the crime scenes. He identifies soil traces. He recognizes blood stains, which, by the way, was fairly unreliable at that time. Thank goodness he had invented the Sherlock Holmes test for hemoglobin, so that you could tell this is human blood, not animal blood. He was using plaster casts of footprints, as Liese mentioned, I think, and other techniques that were new to him. So it was observation, yes, but it was observation of things that people had not been bothering to observe previously, including fingerprints, by the way. The problem with fingerprinting, and fingerprinting clearly shows up in at least one case, the Norwood builder, but this is a time when there isn't yet a database of fingerprints. So you can't use fingerprints to figure out who of the millions who lived in London committed the crime, but you can use fingerprints to match this person who is a suspect. That person's fingerprints match the fingerprints found at the crime. You could do that. And Holmes is very knowledgeable of that, as was, I think, Scotland Yard at that point in time. So, Laurie, your stories are basically set almost 20 years later or more. How did the science change, and what I mean, Mary and Sherlock have kept up, obviously.
Well, of course. Yeah, because the Russell and Holmes books start in 1915. They've got up to 1925. Obviously, 1925 is kind of on the edge of the modern era. And for my purposes, it's kind of a dangerous step, because very soon after the mid-20s, Scotland Yard is going to say, no, we can't involve amateurs like you in our investigations. And so he would become completely external to any official investigation. The 20s is still free to play. I can play and have him involved in various things. But the thing that really fascinates me with the Conan Doyle stories, is that, frankly, and you can close your ears if you want less, frankly, an awful lot of what Holmes does is not so much reasoning as intuition, and his forensic techniques are occasionally utter nonsense. I mean, certainly the stuff about handwriting is, handwriting is still a much debated use in it. But
yeah, let's come back to handwriting, because I agree with you about that. So.
Okay. But what I found really fascinating, and as a, looking over the century and a half since these stories started coming out, the really influential side of things was that giving the impression of science was vital to the stories. Giving the impression that if we are just clever enough and dedicated enough, we can figure stuff out and we can fix it. And that, I think, was very much in line with the strong side of the Victorian era. and certainly influenced hugely where Scotland Yard and every other police department went, that if we just are disciplined and look closely, we can trace back how this happened. And I think that, to my mind, is the real beauty of those stories, is the huge influence. I mean, any writer would love to be half as influential long term, to have the entire Scotland Yard database named after your character, the Home Office Large Major Enquiry Service. I mean, I'd love to have a Russell service just like that, but not going to happen.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I'm sorry, somebody else wanted to chime in.
Well,
Lisa.
I was just going to say, I think that's one of the things that one of the contributions that Arthur Conan Doyle did was he did introduce the concept of science. You know, a lot of criminal investigation was, let's round up the usual suspects and beat them until one of them confesses. Even if they didn't do it, we got the confession. So that's all we need. And it was not, and it was, and I think that's part of the appeal to people, to readers, is that he used science, or he used deduction, he used observation to solve crimes, and, or, you know, whatever you want, you know, whatever it is that he was working on, his case. And you know, even to this day, they talk about the CSI effect from them. Everybody assumes that you're going to be able to do all this kind of science to solve whatever it is. And I think you're right, Laurie. This was one of his major contributions to the fact, and to the point that there was actually, I believe he was German, Hans Gross, actually used the Sherlock Holmes stories to develop a manual for his for the police detectives. You know,
I like to think that point you made, Laurie, about the importance of science in the stories is why the stories were so popular. It was because it appealed to the Victorian mind. The Victorians wanted to believe that they were superior, that their reason and rectitude was going to make the world right. And what could be a better example than Sherlock Holmes, who took those Victorian ideals and put them into practice and caught a lot of crooks. And now, interestingly, some of the sciences, Bonnie pointed out in a chat, that fingerprinting was known. Fingerprints were used for identification way back in the 1820s or 1830s. But it hadn't yet been established as a kind of legal principle that fingerprints were unique. They were, but there wasn't. Nobody was quite sure of that yet. By the way, handwriting was going through much the same kind of debate. The Dreyfus case, there was a good deal of debate by experts about who had written certain letters that were involved in the Dreyfus case, and the experts disagreed. And so the public was still, there was not yet a conviction that handwriting was not as unique as fingerprints, but at least a valuable piece of evidence as the identity of the writer. Now, I just wrote a footnote about this for an edition of the book called The Dead Letter that the Library of Congress is bringing out. The Dead Letter is 1866. And one of the characters talks about his use of handwriting to study the character of the person writing. So that's a different idea. That's the idea now called graphology, that handwriting reveals the character traits. It was a widespread belief at the time, as was, of course, phrenology, that the bumps on your head indicated things about what the brain was doing inside and sort of what your personality was. But that was tied up in the theories of Cesare Lombroso, the Italian scientist, anthropologist, who argued that criminals were made by their, we today say by their DNA, by their genetics, by their inheritance. They were atavisms, but it wasn't their fault. It was their bodies. It was their brains that were making them criminals, and they were just naturally bent that way. And as a result, criminals had outward signals of criminality. They had deformed body shapes or heads, prominent noses, etc. And we see some of that referenced in the Sherlock Holmes stories, that sort of crackpot stuff. And Holmes himself says that he can make deductions based on the character. It's in the Noble Bachelors.
The Blue
No,
Carbuncle.
I'm sorry, not the Noble Bachelors. The Resident Squires.
Right.
In the
And the Blue
Resident-
Carbuncle too.
And the
remember?
Blue Carbuncle. But in the Resident Squires,
Cat.
he
Yeah.
makes deductions from the handwriting in the letters about the character of the people. And, you know,
You have to think that maybe Conan Doyle didn't pay as much attention to Joseph Bell as he thought he did.
well, you know, Bell never quite said well, he did say once, at least explicitly, leave me, not, I'm paraphrasing, leave me alone, I made this stuff up.
Now,
You know,
for
he said it in
anyone
the
in audience
context
who
of,
doesn't know, for anyone who doesn't know, when Conan Doyle went to school, one of his university tutors was a doctor named Bell, who could tell people's problems, jobs, etc., by certain characteristics in their hands and dress and features. And he used that for Sherlock Holmes. But I kind of think that certainly by the 20s, you have fewer physical signs of, for example, employment. You still had a fair number of them. But because so many people in the 20s were starting to move into jobs that were less demanding and less affecting on the body, I'm not sure you could always tell by the signs on their thumbs and fingers and knees what their job was.
and imagine today, imagine
Also-
Sherlock Holmes trying to make those deductions today. I see by the calluses on your fingers that you're somebody who works with a computer. Okay.
No,
Yeah.
I can see you spend a lot of time on Facebook.
Right. That narrows it down considerably.
But yeah, it's
But it's
interesting
brown
because you
brick
also can't tell any class signs either. So if you walk down Baker Street today, you will see the guy that, the barista at Starbucks and some mega rich, guy that owns half the block next door, and they're both will wear North Face jackets. You can't tell anymore. So all those outward class signs are not visible the way they were during Holmes's time.
Right. Although, I will give credit. It's one of the, we don't want to get launched into a discussion of the BBC Sherlock here in any depth,
No,
but
please.
they did do some good deductions there. You still can make deductions from the things that are special. If you're observant, yes, there are, I think, far fewer of them. But there's still occasional ones. That, for example, in what was it called? The Hounds of Baskerville? Was that I've forgotten the name of the middle episode in the second season, where he sees a magazine sort of sticking out of the guy's pocket. And this is a deduction straight from one of the stories, where Holmes sees a copy of the Pinkin, the racing form. Well, people still do that. They walk around with an actual piece of paper racing form. So you could make that kind of deduction today, but it's not as easy. And therefore, I guess it's also not as credible. And that makes it harder for you people writing fiction. Do you bother with credibility, or do you just make it up too and figure, hey, readers will go along with this?
I bother a lot with credibility. A great deal, actually. And another thing I don't want to do is borrow his deductions. I don't want to borrow Conan Doyle's. I want to do ones like them, but not those. So you're not going to have the scratches on the watch.
Boy, that is hard. That's hard. How do you do that? How do you make up an original deduction? This bothered the heck out of Conan Doyle, by the way. Conan Doyle found it extremely difficult to come up with new ideas all the time.
You have to work backwards. Do all of the rest of you work back? I work backwards. It's like, how, like I said, how would he know that this woman is pregnant before her husband does? Or how could he tell that she was decapitated after she was frozen? Or, how could he tell like what happened in what order and by whom? So you have to, oops, hello, are you there?
Yes.
Oh gosh, my computer just hijacked me. So it's basically a backwards thing. So, for example, I wanted to have a special way to kill a singer. And so what is it that singers might do that other people don't do, and so forth. So then I would have to find something he was inhaling or whatever. And anyway, so I work backwards, and then I also go to places like the Wellcome Library, and I just, burrow into there to find out really interesting arcane Victorian medical stuff, and that will work into it as well. Other
Inventive techniques here besides plagiarism. That's always a good one, but not just don't plagiarize Doyle. It's like, just make stuff up. But no, I mean, Doyle not only got tired of doing it, he got lazy too. I mean, so we have stories like the Three Garridebs that is essentially a redo of the Stockbroker's Clerk, which is a redo of the Red-Headed League. I mean, it's like, okay, worked well the first time, I'll just keep using that plot.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I'm trying to think of a case, but sometimes what I do is especially I think in short stories, where I look for what's a cool way to kill somebody. and how can I work that in?
These are all crime writers, Liese. You're not, no, everybody else would say, boy, that person's sick. Call some help. This audience says, of course.
Like I wanted to have something that's coming out in the latest MX publishing anthology of the unsolved cases. And I wanted to include, I shouldn't say too much, I guess.
Don't give away the secret.
Yeah, but that I was thinking I know about the situation. I know of this deaths that occurred this way. How can I work this into a story? And that's kind of how and it's based on, what is it called? The Camberwell poisoning case.
Right.
And so I also had to work in a watch. And how does a watch fit in all that?
Elizabeth, what do you do? I'm not familiar with your technique.
I actually have a series where Conan Doyle is the character. So, and obviously Conan Doyle wrote Sherlock. So he kind of finds himself in unusual situations, and I work with a lot of his real history and just kind of twist it because it's seriously alternate history. So there's definitely some science fiction fantasy elements to it, and but a lot of it is worked around real timelines, real historical events, and actual things that happened in Conan Doyle's life.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I find because I'm writing so much after the stories, and I mean some of them are still being published in 1925, but because most of them are in the past, and because Mary Russell has read them all in the storylines, they can riff off the stories. And the one that I'm working on now is actually set in Romania, and it involves, it's Transylvania, and there's vampires, and very conveniently for me, the Sussex Vampire had been published just a few months beforehand. So no, it was I guess it was 2 years. It was 23 or 24. Anyway, it had been published, and so she read it, and they could make a joke about it and the rest of it, which from my point of view is great, because I can use the stories, I can make reference to the solutions. I can have him say, for those times when the scientific basis of it is a little sketchy. I can have him say that when Watson wrote it up, he kind of ignored what actually happened. Because it makes him look like less of an idiot, so, which is always good for your main character. You don't want him to look like a, well, anyway, you don't want him to look like Arthur Conan Doyle, I guess, but.
Or Nigel Bruce, right.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So, yeah. So Nigel Bruce, you just have to wonder how he could have written those stories. He doesn't seem to be capable of putting together a full sentence in any event. But so I wanted to ask you, and you may think this is all a trick question, but sort of, your favorite bit of research. What is it that you found about Victorian science that you just, even if you didn't work it into a story, that you just said, oh, wow, I got to find out how to use that sometime. It's just so cool. Elizabeth, what about you? You've done a lot of this research,
I
know.
I mean, I've been to the UK like about 6 times, spent a lot of time in Edinburgh. There's a wonderful museum, if anybody's ever been to Edinburgh, the Pathology Museum and the Surgeons Museum, which is right across the street from the campus, one of the areas of the University of Edinburgh campus. And they actually have the only existing film of Conan Doyle speaking, and they have that on a continuous loop. But I had absolutely no idea how many Scottish doctors got into, I mean, Lister, we think of Listerine, which I'm sure was named after him, but
yeah.
Got into some of the first antiseptics. It's actually quite amazing when I was doing research for all this, how many Scotsmen were real pioneers as far as anatomy and surgery and all that stuff, and including actually a lot of science as well. If you go to the National Museum of Scotland, I think it is, they have all sorts of technology and steam engines, and it's just mind-blowing how much what is going on. But I had no idea that the Scots were so involved with a lot of that, and you could see so actually being there physically, in the city and seeing some of the inventions that were new, with these big innovative scientific both medical and mechanical and you name it, it was just burgeoning back then. And it's just I mean, I collect Victorian science books. I love this stuff. It's just so much fun to see what was going on, because for some reason it was like an explosion. It was like so much was happening in such a small period of time towards the latter part of the 19th century. It's just, mind-blowing. So, and then at the same time, all sorts of people were believing in seances. So, you had this like big dichotomy of science versus, mysticism or the occult. So, and people were trying to prove that. And so there was just a lot going on. I just totally enjoy kind of getting in their feet first or head first or whatever you want to call it, and actually physically being there and doing the research.
So Bonnie, you did that kind of research, and yours was really tough. You had to research Scotch malt liquor. That was.
It was a tough job. Somebody had to do it.
It was. I'm sure.
Yeah, my second Holmes adventure is called Unquiet Spirits, and it took place in the Highlands of Scotland, mostly in and around a castle and a distillery. And so I didn't know what was going to happen until I kind of went there, and that's where I discovered the ice pit in a special little ice house. And I thought, I have to set a scene in here because it's really spooky and creepy. And then I went and actually I became friends with a whiskey expert, Charlie McLean, and he told me to go to the island of Islay, which is spelled Islay, but it's pronounced Islay. And there is a whiskey distillery that still uses the 19th century equipment. to its extent, and they're actually operating with it. So I knew that I wanted a big scene in the distillery, and when I went there, I sort of scoped out the gigantic, terrifying machinery, these big rakes that go through the stuff, and how hot it is, and how and then there's little sections of the distillery where if you're standing there and they're not airing it out, you just take a couple breaths and you're dead. So, it's just all kinds of, intense science around this thing. So that was tremendously inspiring. So in that case, I did what feels to me like location scouting for a film, but it's location scouting for the book. And I usually do that early on in the, I think, Laurie, you do this too. I think you go places and location scout, and so the environment and the things that are there and the people and what they do.
Yeah. Tax deductible trips is the way I see it, but,
Yeah. And of course I had to taste a little bit of this.
Of course. Liese, you've written a lot of columns about sort of niche areas of Victorian science and all that. What was the most fascinating of yours?
Oh gosh, it's hard. I think one of them that I found fascinating was typewriters, for a whole lot of different reasons. One is it created a set of jobs for women that didn't exist before, and that was fascinating. But even more, I forget. I'm really bad with names and everything. Did I write it down? There was a story where the typewriter was prominent, and what he found was that which one? Oh well. Anyway, he looked at it and he noticed a defect in the typing. And he actually wrote that story, and it came out before it was ever used in a case. And I thought
it's a case of identity. It's
a case of identity. You're right. Yeah. And that, to me, that was fascinating. I mean, I think one of the terms that I heard recently describing Holmes and his methods was prescience. That he presented information, the way he approached cases was something that later on other people used, but he did it first. And I thought that was very interesting.
Laurie, was there some eureka moment in your research other than Japanese toilets? That's a whole other subject.
Well, it's a little beyond the time of the book is set, but
yes. Well, but you worked it in anyway. You had Japanese toilets in the I've forgotten which book it was, but
baths, not so much toilets, but baths.
Baths, okay.
Yeah, it's a different matter. I feel like saying, I'm not a scientist. I've been just playing fiction, because part of the book, the stories that I write are not so much to do with his scientific side of his investigation. They're mostly set in other parts of the world, not in a place where he has a lab. They're the kind of investigation that involves a lot of, talking to people rather than looking closely. I tend to have him find specific things, or have Russell find specific things and make deductions out of those. But for the most part, my research has consisted of, as you say, going to places and finding some really cool things, and then going home and doing research on them. So, I'll discover that, Lily Langtry lived in Monaco. And so,
right.
So my book becomes all Lily Langtry. And of course, there's things like looking at one of the other characters that was the armaments king, Zakharov. So you always get sucked into doing research into, the early submarines that he sold to both sides, neither of which got them to work. But when it comes to actually looking at the evidence and drawing conclusions from them in the Conan Doyle sense. I don't tend to use that an awful lot in the 20s.
I understand. I mean, and frankly, neither did Conan Doyle. I mean, nobody reads. I always say that people who read the Sherlock Holmes stories today, nobody can really read them unless you're 10 years old. You can't read them for the excitement of, oh, aha, there's a technique for solving a crime, or there's a brilliant deduction, or all that. We read them because of the friendship. We read them because of the wonderful atmosphere of these stories, the dialogue, etc. And they're cluttered today with what today we would judge are cliches. I always point out the butler did it in one of Conan Doyle's stories, and in another story there's a headless corpse that modern readers, of course, we know perfectly well that's going to turn out to be not the body of the person we expect it to be.
Why else would you cut off a head?
Right. So these were new ideas at the time, but today they've become cliches.
It's like Shakespeare. He just writes all these cliches.
I know, he just, it's like, I heard that before.
Yeah, that's so familiar.
I like to tell, I'd be remiss to not share my favorite bit of bizarre research, which was actually had to do with Dracula, not Sherlock Holmes. It was a strange Victorian science that was pursuing the idea that the retina retained the image that it saw at the moment of death.
Right.
And there was a kind of a mad scientist who did a great deal of research into this with killing little bunnies and then cutting out their eyeballs to see what the images were. And they had this theory about how it was like a pinhole camera, that the light would be seared onto the retina. And of course, it was completely bogus, but it features not only in Dracula, Jules Verne wrote a whole mystery novel in which the criminal is caught by examining the retina of the victim. Those wacky Victorians, what can I say? So I mentioned the book earlier, and I wanted to show it to everybody. This is, this won the Edgar about 10 years ago, I think, by E.J. Wagner, our friend E.J. Wagner, called The Science of Sherlock Holmes. A wonderful book surveying the forensic science of the day and showing how Holmes used some of the techniques and how some of them he didn't, but they're sort of involved in the stories. I highly recommend this book. I think we're at the point where we should probably open it up to questions. Yes, Bonnie, did you want to?
I just wanted to recommend this one by B.J. Ron. It also has a really nice section on the forensics. She's a good book too.
And there's a third one, which I'm not holding up, called the Sherlock Holmes and Science, which won the Edgar even more recently. It's mainly about chemistry, but it covers other subjects as well. This is the time for audience questions, and let me look at some of the ones that we've already gotten and see. So there was a question for you, Elizabeth, to talk a little bit about Doyle's spiritualism and how that, what you learned about it and sort of how it fits into some of your stories and whatever else you want to say about it.
It definitely fits into my stories. One of the interesting things, and I work it into the fiction, of course, is that Doyle, he belonged to a lot, the Society of Psychical Research. He actually belonged to a organization called the Ghost Club. But a lot of the people who belonged to these organizations were scientists and also members of parliament. But a lot of these people were trying to prove life after death, or the existence of ghosts, or the existence of ectoplasmic emanations at seances. So a lot of these people looked at it from a very scientific point of view, which is kind of interesting because, a lot of other people said, this is pseudoscience. So, but he was incredibly fascinated by that, and I definitely play it up in my in my novels.
Laurie, are we going to see some spiritualist things, or I don't recall any in any of the books? And of course, this is a time when Conan Doyle in the late 20s was extremely active in the spiritualist movement.
Well,
He doesn't really appear in your books.
our agency stands flat-footed upon the ground last, so.
Well,
yeah, I think there's one early books has to do with a woman's religious movement, and it says that this woman that she's met and is teaching about Old Testament is a mystic, and there's a miraculous healing in it that she can't explain. And it was one of those places where, someone like me who writes something, I don't outline, so I never quite know what I'm writing until I write it. And I get to the end and I look at the rewrite and think, oh, that should come out. And then I think, maybe not, so I'm not sure why it's there. I should say that's how the manuscript reached me, because I am only the editor for Mary Russell.
We know that, yes, right.
But yeah, I think that, there are a lot of things that are unexplained that will remain unexplained, that are corners of the human mind that are not really clear. And I think that's always fun to run Sherlock Holmes's mind up against those and see what he does with them.
Someone asked a question about the Enola Holmes case. And by the way, if you have questions, please post them on chat and we'll try and get to them. So as many of you know, the Conan Doyle Estate Limited, Laurie and I took them to court once for their challenging of a book that we had done, in which they said that we were not free to use the characters of Holmes and Watson in new stories because there remained 10 stories in copyright. And we were violating the continuing copyright of the Conan Doyle Estate by doing that. The court said nonsense. Only the character elements that appear exclusively in the last copyrighted stories are protected. Well, so now the Conan Doyle Estate Limited, which is, by the way, a company owned primarily by collateral relatives of Arthur Conan Doyle. These are his brother's grandchildren. They have now sued Netflix and Legendary Pictures, etc., for the film Enola Holmes, arguing that yes, and they cite Klinger versus Conan Doyle Estate Limited and say, you're using characteristics that appeared exclusively in the last copyrighted stories, namely the emotional warmth of Sherlock Holmes. Well, first of all, if you've seen...
Emo Holmes is a new thing there.
Right. So if you've seen the film, he's not exactly emo, but even so, the Sherlockian world was, I'm actually involved. I was a technical advisor for the film, and I helped write the reply, the answer filed in the case, and with the help of a number of other Sherlockians who all sent me citations of, well, what about this case where he's emotional, and this case where he's emotional, and so on. If you're interested, Laurie and I created, whatever that was now, 6 years ago, a website called free-Sherlock.com, which has not only on it all the papers from the original litigation, but it now has the filings in this litigation, both the complaint and the answer. And there's another challenge going on. Thank you, Bonnie. There's another challenge going on as well that Laurie and I got angry about, which is a filing in the U.S. Trademark Office seeking a trademark in the name Sherlock Holmes for ebooks, films, and the like. They already filed an application for books, which we opposed and which they immediately withdrew after our opposition was filed. But once again, they have filed an application in these other categories. We've filed an opposition. I understand that Legendary and some of the others are also filing oppositions. I suspect it will not go anywhere. But trademark is a very dangerous area for creators because trademarks don't expire, at least not by virtue of time. So Laurie has filed a trademark, I'm sure, for Mary Russell at this point, but and the rest of you who are writing about Sherlock Holmes, too bad. You know, you can't trademark Sherlock Holmes, but oh well, at least I think. Okay, so other questions from the audience here? Let's see. Somebody wanted to know, and this is kind of a broad question, when you're writing your fiction, do you prefer to write about brain work or science? Reason versus science? Not sure that you can separate those, but go ahead. I don't have to answer this question, so.
I think I already have. I mean, I talk about investigations, but I don't tend to zero in on the science. So I've answered it.
Okay. Bonnie, comments? Lisa?
Yeah, I was looking for I see it. Do you prefer having the protagonists use their intellect and deduction and legwork, or forensics and science? You can't really separate them, actually, because I mean, if they're using their if they're using deduction, they're deducing things from details, and therefore they're observing these details. And like I said, most of the details in the original Holmes stories don't fall into the forensics category. I mean, there's a few, like we said, the blood spatters and the footprints and the fingerprints, but most of them are just like, you know, there's something, this window was open, or the drapes wouldn't have been this way, or, you know, which I don't really think of as forensics, but as observations and deductions. And to me, those are used sparingly. It's almost like spice in a dish. You know, if the whole story or the whole book is that, you're going to bore the heck out of the reader. But you have to use it really judiciously and cleverly, and then it's exciting. But it's really more observation and deduction, I think. And then, because the science that is in the Conan Doyle things, often he's like tinkering around with his little chemistry corner at 221B, and you know, some of this stuff is completely spurious that they talk about. And some of it is the science of the day. I'm married to a scientist, so I love to put real science in there. So like we had to, in the last book I just wrote, some of it takes place at the Cavendish Labs in Cambridge, which was a center for scientific research. My husband got all excited and was talking to me all about Ruhmkorff coils, and so he's crazy. He bought one. We have one now in here. So I mean, some of these.
Doesn't everyone?
Everyone has a Ruhmkorff coil in their house. But anyway, so yes, science. But like I said, it's like a seasoning. You know, it's just like it's, you know, a payoff moment, or it's a launching pad, but it's not the whole story. The whole story is, as Les said, it's really about the friendship. It's about the danger, the adventure, the outre quality of the crimes and the murders. Has Gothic qualities. So it's a bunch of things, and the science is part of it.
One of the problems with writing science too is that if you have your characters who are focused in on an investigation to the extent that they are, you know, doing scientific experiments to prove a point, there's not a lot of suspense for the reader. And if you're aiming at creating suspense, you need to put bits of it in here and bits there, and you lead up to the evidence in the lab. So it's, you know, as a storyteller, it's not always the most effective way to show the conclusion of a hypothesis.
And I would point out an example of how you can fail using just the science. Nobody here in this audience actually read these when they first came out, but Craig Kennedy, known as the American Sherlock Holmes, was billed as the scientific detective. And those stories were by Arthur B. Reeve. They came out in between roughly 1910 to 1925. They were incredibly popular at the time, and no one reads them anymore because the characters are so colorless and the science is all outdated. So, you know, that's the peril of writing about forensics and that sort of stuff, is that if you don't have interesting characters, who cares?
Cutting
Well,
edge
in the
good stuff.
remaining, we have about 5 minutes left, and I always want to have our panelists use this for commercials. So starting with you, Lisa, why don't you talk about your next project that's coming out?
Yeah, I have out already the first 2 cases in the early case files of Sherlock Holmes. The third one is going to the editor shortly, like maybe Monday if I can work on it tomorrow and get it done. And then it'll probably be out early in 2021. And I'm almost complete. I've almost completed volume 3 of the Life and Times of Sherlock Holmes, which are the small essays. And that should be out by the end of the year, just in time for Christmas. For
Great.
need a Sherlockian present. And then also I have the one that's the short story that's coming out in the MX Publishing.
Great. Elizabeth, what's coming down the pike for you?
Well, my current work in progress is called A War in Too Many Worlds. And this time it features a lot more of Conan Doyle. And his antagonist is basically H.G. Wells.
Oh, wow.
And they wind up in an adventure together where it's almost a mashup between the Hound of the Baskervilles and the Island of Dr. Moreau.
Wow.
So I'm working on that. And I have 3 Hollywood mysteries that are completed that I'm still shopping around and looking for a new agent. And I think my next project is going to be something based on Doyle, but a straight mystery, none of the alternate history, and based on a real historical case. So that's kind of up the pipeline.
Bonnie, yours is called The Three Locks. And
Yes.
and then the next followed by the sequel, which is And a Bagel, right?
All right, and cream cheese and a schmear. Anyway, yes. So no, what it's going to be, yeah, The Three Locks is going to come out next March, and it takes place in Cambridge in London, and it takes place a year earlier than the first. Mine are sequential in years. The first one is 88, 89, 90, then this one is 87, but they don't have to be read in any particular order. And then there's going to be one more after that. So, but The Three Locks is a lot of fun because it's in all of my books, Holmes is too smart to have one case keep him busy for a whole novel, in my view, in the traditional style. So what I usually do is I have more than one case, usually 3, and they convolve kind of like a triple helix. So they, and hopefully they connect in some way, not entirely, but somewhat. And that's the fun of it for me, is to try to figure out this puzzle and really challenge him and put some danger and adventure, because as we all know, it's the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, not the mysteries of Sherlock Holmes, right?
Right.
So anyway, that's that. Yeah.
So Bonnie, are you an outliner? Bonnie,
Sorry?
are you
Yes.
an outliner?
No, I'm a pantser, just like you. I'm a total pantser. And I know what the crimes are, and I know who did it, and I have no idea how they connect or how it unravels. I have no idea when I start.
Laurie, what's the title of the next book?
Castle Shade. Castle Shade will be out in June, fingers crossed. I've just finished my read through of getting ready to do the second draft edit. I'm hoping to get it done before Christmas. Is there a Christmas this year? I don't think so, but I'm hoping to get it done before then. And it's it's a lot of fun because it's a fairy tale and it's got spooky stuff and it's silly, and so I'm having fun with it, and I get to write notes to Les to say, when you were at Brand, did you see?
Great stuff. Great stuff. A wonderful place. Nothing to do with Dracula, but a great place. So.
Yeah.
The one thing before we sign off, I have a cheat sheet that I put together of different forensic situations throughout the Sherlockian canon, and I have it posted on my website for anybody to use as inspiration, research, whatever. So if you go to elizabethcrowens.com, under the blogs or the post, it's the most recent post.
And while you're there, you can order books. So
That, and I also have a link to an article where I interviewed last. So,
Well, so have I mentioned that Laurie and I have a new anthology coming out? Yes, I think I
Oh,
did.
Les.
And that'll be out in December. It's available for pre-order on everywhere, called In League
The
with
name of
Sherlock
it?
Holmes. And let's see, what else am I working on? Yes, the new annotated Jekyll and Hyde will be out maybe next year. And then there's another dozen books in the Haunted Library of Horror Classics and the Library of Congress Crime Classics. But in any event, thank you for being with us. This is a wonderful time to be a Sherlockian because there are so many opportunities to join with other Sherlockians at places like this without having to get on any airplanes or cars or whatever. So great to share with everybody, and we hope to be in person next year for a similar panel. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Les.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Les.